Mamdani backpedals after Extell Development's $2.8 billion tower halts construction. Extell Development doesn't build ordinary towers. It builds the kind of buildings that end up on postcards. Central Park Tower, rising over 1,500 feet above Midtown, currently the tallest residential building on the entire planet. 157, the glass sliver that redefined what a Manhattan penthouse could sell for when it first opened over a decade ago. Gary Barnett, the company's founder, spent 30 years building a reputation as the developer willing to take on projects nobody else believed could get financed, permitted, or actually finished on schedule. He came up in the diamond business before pivoting into real estate in the 1980s, and colleagues who've worked with him for decades described the same trait over and over, an almost stubborn willingness to keep pushing a project forward through financing headaches, zoning fights, and construction delays that would have killed a lesser company's appetite years earlier. That reputation was supposed to carry into the next chapter. A new super-tall residential tower planned for Midtown West, priced at $2.8 billion in projected construction and financing costs, designed to add roughly 1,200 luxury and market-rate units to a neighborhood already straining under a housing shortage nobody seriously disputes exists. The project broke ground 18 months ago, and by most accounts, it had proceeded about as smoothly as a project this size ever does. Steel had started going up. Cranes were already visible from 3 avenues away. 4,000 construction jobs were tied directly to the project reaching completion on its original 5-year timeline, spanning everyone from structural engineers to electricians to the small businesses that cater lunch to job sites this size every single day. 3 weeks ago, all of it stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. The cranes went quiet. The construction fencing stayed up, but nothing moved behind it, and neighbors who'd grown used to the daily rhythm of trucks and deliveries noticed the silence almost immediately. The mayor, whose signature housing agenda depends on exactly this kind of large-scale development actually happening, went unusually quiet at the precise moment the cameras showed up, looking for an explanation, a silence that stood out precisely because this administration has rarely been shy about explaining its policy decisions in detail. You don't have to live near Midtown West for this one to matter to you. Any city trying to solve a housing shortage by leaning on large private developers is only one policy misstep away from watching a project this size go dark overnight. It's happened before, in other cities, under different mayors, and it's happening again right now. Subscribe before we continue, because there's a number buried inside Extell's financing agreement that never made it into a single news segment covering this story, and it's the actual reason 4,000 jobs are sitting frozen right now. April 22nd, 2026. The city's Department of Buildings, acting on a directive tied to a new construction financing oversight law passed earlier this year, issues a stop work order on the Midtown West Tower. The law itself was designed with good intentions. In the wake of several high-profile construction accidents at other sites across the city over the past 2 years, incidents that generated real public pressure on the council to act, City Hall pushed through legislation requiring additional insurance bonding and safety compliance audits on any project exceeding a certain size threshold before construction can proceed past a specific structural milestone. It passed with broad support, including from several council members who represent districts with major active construction sites of their own. Extell's tower crossed that milestone right as the new law took effect, which meant it got caught in a review process that didn't exist when the project broke ground 18 months earlier. The audit itself isn't unreasonable on its face. Nobody, including Extell, is arguing that safety oversight on a building this size is a bad idea in principle, and the company's own public statement went out of its way to say as much, careful not to frame this as an attack on the policy itself. The problem is timing, and the problem is money. The audit process, according to permitting attorneys familiar with similar reviews at other large sites, typically takes 4 to 6 months to complete for a project of this scale, given the sheer number of subcontractors, structural engineers, and safety consultants who all need to submit documentation and sit for individual interviews as part of the compliance file. Extell's financing agreement with its lead lender includes a construction continuity clause, the kind of standard language buried in nearly every large development loan in the industry, which allows the lender to reassess the entire loan's terms if construction halts for longer than 90 days for reasons outside routine weather delays. Extell didn't choose to stop building. The new law effectively chose it for them, but the lender doesn't particularly care who's at fault, or how reasonable the underlying safety law might be. It cares about risk, and a stalled $2.8 billion project, sitting empty for months, looks like risk, no matter which government agency caused the pause, or how good the agency's intentions were when it wrote the rule. City Hall's public statement framed this as a routine safety measure, applied evenly to every large project citywide, with no singling out of any specific developer. That's technically accurate. It's also almost entirely beside the point that actually matters here, because evenly applied doesn't mean evenly felt, and a policy that lands the same way on paper can land in wildly different ways, depending entirely on where a given project happened to sit on its construction timeline the week the law took effect. Here's what the technically accurate statement leaves out. The new audit requirement was modeled, according to City Council testimony from the bill's sponsors, on safety standards already in place in several other major cities, and by most engineering assessments, it's a reasonable, even overdue, piece of legislation. Nobody serious is arguing City Hall wrote this law specifically to target Extell or to hurt this particular project, and it would be inaccurate and unfair to suggest otherwise. But here's the number that never made it into the press coverage. The bill's own fiscal impact statement, filed with the City Council before the vote, estimated that citywide compliance costs for large developers would total approximately $180 million annually across the entire construction industry. That's the number City Hall cited publicly as evidence the law was measured and proportionate, a modest cost spread across an entire multi-billion-dollar industry. What that fiscal note didn't estimate, and what nobody on the council apparently asked about before voting, was how many active projects would get caught mid-construction by the audit timeline the exact way Extell's tower did, sitting in the awkward window where a building has already crossed the structural milestone that triggers review, but hasn't yet had time to complete it. Extell's lender identified that exact gap immediately, faster than City Hall apparently did. The construction continuity clause wasn't written with a 4 to 6 month government safety audit in mind. It was written to protect against contractor disputes, funding shortfalls, or labor strikes. Problems within a developer's own control to resolve quickly through negotiation or additional capital. An audit timeline set entirely by a city agency's staffing and scheduling capacity isn't something Extell can accelerate, no matter how much money or pressure it applies to the process. So the lender did what any risk-averse institution does when a borrower's project timeline suddenly depends entirely on a variable outside anyone's control. It froze additional draws on the construction loan until the audit clears, which means Extell can't pay its subcontractors, which means the subcontractors can't pay their crews, which means 4,000 jobs went from active to indefinitely paused within about 10 days of the stop work order landing. $180 million in projected annual compliance costs, citywide, across an entire industry, treated publicly as evidence the policy was reasonable and proportionate. Against that, a single $2.8 billion project and 4,000 jobs frozen almost immediately, because nobody modeled, at least not publicly, what happens to a project caught in the specific timing gap between breaking ground under old rules and getting audited under new ones. Step into the shoes of a steel erector working this site for the past year, because the story stops being abstract the second you do. He's 41, has 2 kids in a public school, 3 subway stops from the site, and has spent the last decade building a specific, valuable skill set, assembling structural steel at extreme heights on supertall towers, a trade with genuinely limited demand outside a handful of Manhattan megaprojects at any given time. It took him years to work up to the pay grade he's at now, moving between a handful of major sites across the city as each one topped out and the next one broke ground, timing his transitions carefully so he was never without work for more than a few weeks at a stretch. This was supposed to be the project that carried him comfortably through the next 3 years. When this job paused, there wasn't another supertall tower actively hiring steel crews anywhere in the 5 boroughs. His union local has him on a waiting list behind several hundred other workers from other paused or delayed projects across the city, all competing for the same small handful of open slots. Because it turns out Extell's tower isn't the only project that happened to cross that structural milestone right as the new audit law took effect. He's not eligible for unemployment in the traditional sense, because technically the job hasn't been terminated. It's paused, indefinitely, which puts him in a strange limbo where he's still employed on paper but hasn't received a paycheck in 3 weeks and has no confirmed date when that changes. His mortgage doesn't care about the distinction between paused and terminated. Neither does his kid's school lunch account or the car payment that comes out of his account on the 15th of every month, regardless of whether he worked that month or not. His foreman is in a worse position in some ways, managing a crew of 35 who all call him daily, asking the same question he doesn't have an answer to, because the honest answer is that nobody, not Extell, not the lender, not the Department of Buildings, can tell him with any confidence when the audit will actually clear. The concrete supplier, who had 2 trucks a day scheduled for this site, has already redirected that capacity to a project in New Jersey, meaning even once the audit clears, Extell will need to rebuild parts of its supply chain from scratch, adding weeks the original timeline never accounted for, and pushing the eventual restart even further out than the audit alone would suggest. Multiply that steel erector by 4,000 workers across every trade tied to this single tower. Electricians, plumbers, glaziers, elevator technicians, the security guards who patrol the site overnight. And multiply this one paused project by however many other developments across the city are sitting in that same narrow timing gap between old construction rules and new audit requirements. And the $180 million compliance estimate starts looking less like a measured policy cost and more like a number that was calculated without ever asking what happens to the people standing on the scaffolding when the timeline itself becomes the variable nobody can control. Extell didn't set out to become a cautionary tale about regulatory timing gaps, and the city didn't set out to accidentally freeze $2.8 billion in construction with a law aimed at making job sites safer. Both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels out the 4,000 people currently sitting without a paycheck while lawyers and lenders work through a review process nobody built with this exact scenario in mind. The safety audit was designed, reasonably, to prevent the kind of construction accidents that have made headlines at other sites in this city over the past 2 years. Nobody designed, or apparently even considered, what happens to a project and its workforce when the audit's own timeline collides directly with a standard financing clause that exists in nearly every large development loan in the industry. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a safety law causes real, immediate financial harm to thousands of workers as an unintended side effect of good intentions, does the city owe those workers anything beyond an accurate statement that the policy was applied evenly and fairly to every large project citywide? Let us know where you land in the comments. And we're not done with this thread. Next, we're looking at how many other stalled projects across the 5 boroughs are sitting in this exact same timing gap right now, waiting on an audit queue that keeps getting longer.